of balancing the teaching of history and convergence, and that's what Chris and I are going to talk about today. I really face two challenges in dealing with this issue. One is trying to teach history in the age of convergence. At the same time, you have to make room at a time when all of these technical changes seem a little bit overwhelming because it's so rapid. One of the things that I like to point out is that we've never lost a mass medium, that the history of mass media is also gives us a lot of insight into predicting what's going to happen, understanding the age that we're living in now. And even today, even though we might be reading newspapers on the smartphone or iPads, we're still calling them newspapers. We're still calling them magazines. We're still calling it television and radio. I think just in the trajectory of how amazing this change is, I look at, the early broadsheet newspapers and the latest configurations of newspapers. A good example of what's gone on in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the Ann Arbor News is now called AnnArbor.com. And it comes out on just Thursdays and Sundays with the masthead AnnArbor.com. It's mostly an online newspaper today. I think the key points for our students in this particular age is showing them that, first of all, that convergence is not new, that it's located in history. We have early examples, for instance, of RCA buying the Victor talking machine company in the 1920s. This was an early convergence of radio and music. We have the introduction of TV Guide in the magazine industry in the early 50s, where really you had magazines converging with TV, one medium using another medium as its content. Probably the example that many of us probably use a lot is the partnership between the radio industry and the music industry in the 1950s to confront the challenges of television. I also like to point out to students the irony of Amazon.com, one of our first real entrepreneurial successes in the internet, making its name selling the oldest mass medium, the book. And even Chris and I and Bettina in media and culture, we converged, in the recent edition, we converged the cable chapter and the TV chapter. So this is something that we all struggle with. For me, the key question is about how important history is for our students. Even something as simple as studying the telegraph industry and showing students that the ones and zeros of binary code in their digital world is just an update and a contemporary use of the dots and dashes of the Morse code. This idea that you can sort of configure all kinds of messages and information in a binary system. The other thing that I like to talk about is how important it is, even to businesses, to sort of understand the flow of media history. I'm always amazed when I first started teaching in a Wi-Fi classroom, and you'd look out in an intro to mass media class and you'd see all of these students with their computers and laptops thinking they were taking notes like good students, and then slowly understanding, well, no, they're not. They're on Facebook, they're shopping, they're doing all sorts of things, they're playing solitaire. That was a pretty radical change for me. And one of the things that I point out to students, I like to use the Time Warner AOL deal to show them as an example of moving from this wired to wireless world. And just the sort of lack of clear-headed thinking by the Time Warner folks when they decided the merger with AOL in the early 2000s would be a good idea. The whole history of media has been going from wired technology to wireless technology. If you go back from the telegraph to the radio, why someone would think it would be a good idea to merge with a dial-up internet system in the early 2000s when the trajectory of media history suggests, we're going to be moving continually to figuring out how to get rid of the wires, still baffles me. One of the things that I talk a lot about is the end of mass communication in this digital world and the rise of niche markets and fragmented audiences. And one of my concerns is this kind of a loss of a common culture. I see this in my own classes. When I used to be able to start class 20, 25 years ago and could count on them having watched the news the night before or watched NBC's lineup of shows on a Thursday evening. And you could count maybe on half the class at least having had that sort of touchstone. Today what I can pretty much count on is they've all been on Facebook that day or the day before. Every one of them has been. But they're all doing something very different. They've customized Facebook for their own interests. And that sort of lack of a common touchstone, I think, is something that we all struggle with. I think that one of the ways that I like to talk about this rise of niche markets and fragmented audiences is in terms of trying to understand this new partisan era that we're in. That when you talk about newspaper history in the early news, which started out in a partisan era in the late 1700s, and today we're living in a world, particularly in cable TV news, that's highly partisan and is really in many ways a kind of a neo-partisan era in which we're returning to a time when the sort of staking out sort of very extreme positions on one side or the other has become sort of the norm in a lot of our mass media. And again, I think this is an important idea that the sort of erosion of a common ground, common places to start talking about issues that are important to all of us. One of the things in sort of studying history, I always point out to students, in the 19th century and most of the 20th century, the way you made money in the news business was by claiming neutrality, by supporting this notion of objectivity. And publishers in the 19th century learned really fast that they didn't offend anybody on the left or the right, and they claimed neutrality, they actually could grow their audiences. And that's not what's happening today. I mean, the way that you grow your audience, particularly in cable news, is through appealing to sort of niche partisan audiences. And that's something very different. But again, the trajectory of history shows we started out at that partisan point, and we're at that point again in many ways, although it's a digital form of that. One of the assignments that I've included here today gets at this issue of common ground. I teach a lot about storytelling and narrative in my classes, and it's one of my interests as a researcher. And one of the things that I argue is that storytelling and narrative is the dominant way that we make sense of our experience and that we articulate our values. And I do an early assignment, an oral history assignment, that's sort of actually set up to get students to explore common ground with a parent or grandparent. And I have them, I sort of show them two excerpts from two very different arguments. One is from Neil Postman from Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985, and I contrast that with an excerpt from Stephen Johnson in 2005, his book, Everything Bad is Good for You. And these contrasting arguments, Postman essentially argues that the sort of rise of visual culture has coarsened our discourse, coarsened our ability to talk to one another, and we're less smart for this. Stephen Johnson makes the opposite argument, that in today's digital world, our students are actually smarter because of how complicated television series have become, because of the complexity of video games. So we have these competing arguments, and one of the things that I try to get at in this exercise is whether, what the generational differences are in terms of, our contemporary media making us smarter or dumber, and that leads to a lot of really rich discussions. But one of the key things I do in this exercise is I ask students to make a list of storytelling and the common stories, particularly on television, that they share with their parent or grandparent. What are their sort of shared interests, and what is it about those shared interests? What are they looking for in a good story? What are the themes? What's the conflict? What kind of characters are they identifying with? And then I ask them to make another list of what are the differences. What kind of shows are they watching that their parents or grandparents aren't watching? And then in the end, we talk a lot about what we found there. So that's an exercise that I've had enormous success with. It's never failed me, and it's one that I continue to go back to. I think at this point I'm going to halt my section and turn it over to my colleague, Chris Martin. And again, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard. And actually, I wanted to point out a comment from one of our participants, Rich Risky, who noted the book, The Master Switch, The Rise and Fall of Information Empires by Tim Wu. That's actually a really great book, so thanks for pointing that out. What I want to talk about is that over the years, as Richard had said, we've had to rethink how we teach mass communication. Traditionally, as you know, the study's been organized by medium and industry. So, if you look at a typical textbook, there will be chapters on books and radio, television, film, etc. But as all this content is now being converged digitally, it makes us consider whether a mass medium if the medium is a distribution channel or device, or rather if the medium is the content that we traditionally know on that medium. So, for example, to extend a little bit what Richard had said, a film, we might call something a film, but it's actually not shot on celluloid anymore. It's shot in a digital format. We call something a TV show, but we might watch it on a computer. We might be listening to an album, but it's something we actually downloaded. It was never on a 12-inch vinyl disc. We listen to the radio, but we might actually listen to that program on an iPod, not really a radio. And again, as Richard said, a newspaper might sound like it's on paper, but we actually read it on an iPad or a mobile phone, which apparently more and more people are doing these days, according to a recent Pew study. So we've taught about the history of a mass medium, how it emerged, and so now we're actually going from talking about how it emerged to thinking about the recent history of each mass medium and how it's converged. So we're going from kind of emergence to convergence and tying those things together and how we think about the mass media. So I wanted to talk about a few examples of how I've tried to do that in the classroom and get students to think about those things. One way I started is with a question. I asked students, what were the main media technologies in your life 10 years ago? So for a student that, might be anywhere from typically 18 to 22 or even older, they think back and think like, wow, it was actually quite different. And so what I tell them is a decade ago, just to kind of clarify, there was no YouTube, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, no iPhone, no Android operating system, and certainly not the iPad. And you can think of other devices like iPods as well. And even Wikipedia was actually just starting out 10 years ago, and it's likely that most people hadn't even had much experience with that. So it makes them think about how quickly things change, especially now. Part of what we've studied in thinking about the history is based on these kind of legacy mass media, at least devices. So when you think about what a radio is or looks like, or what a TV is or looks like, we oftentimes think about these these iconic images. So if you think about a television, the universal symbol of what a TV looks like, it's kind of this box with two antennas sticking out of the top. Most people don't watch TV that way these days. So let me give an example from sound recording as well. And there's a number of different formats in the history of sound recording. What I'd like to start is with something that students are more familiar with. So I certainly covered the rest of the history as well, going all the way back to the initial sound recordings and cylinders and things like that. But more recently, students are familiar with CDs, which is a format that developed in the 1980s. It replaced the vinyl formats, became the most popular music format in the 1990s, replaced cassettes as well. I almost forgot about that. If you lived in the 80s, you know about cassettes. So in their lifetimes, Format 2 came along, another format in the fall of 1999. In the music industry, seeing its great success with CDs, I mean, they really got so many people to re-buy music that they'd had on vinyl and buy it on CDs. They made a great fortune in the 80s and 90s. That was kind of wearing out by the late 90s, and the music industry was actually working to move us to a new format, a more expensive format that was better than just CDs. And it was potentially setting up a format war, not unlike what we saw with VHS and Beta, back in the 1970s and early 80s. And so we had DVD audio and super audio CD, both of which were going to cost, roughly in the low 20s per DVD or CD. And I tell the students, but the battle is interrupted, and I ask them, well, what happened in '99 that actually changed things? And some students will still remember, oh yeah, that was the year that something else came along, that Napster came along. And so we get a new format then in 1999, the MP3, which became the most popular format of the first decade of the 2000s. So we have Napster as this first easy-to-use service for file sharing. And students are familiar with Napster, and also that it got run out of business. And then there were a number of other services that have kind of come and gone in the wake of that. So Kazaa, Fast Track, Audio Galaxy, iMesh, and you can ask students to raise their hands. And this is something to follow up later on when you talk about mass media and legal issues, because they've all been kind of part of at least using some of those illegal software packages. So most of those are now shut down. What happened was in a big way was really the official legal format in 2003, which was as you know, iTunes, and it became an incredibly successful legitimate music download service. And that's really helped to lead the way to solidifying MP3s as being a legal service and a legal format for the music industry. What's more interesting beyond that, and students are very familiar with that, of course, is I talk about how we're in the midst of another format change. And it gets them to think about, we love music, and all these are just ways to enjoy music and listen to music. But we're now in the midst of another format change. A lot of people might not even realize that we're right there. But it's shifting to music being in the cloud. So we're used to, owning, vinyl or CDs, or even, owning our music files, which we downloaded to, our iPods and our computers. But music in the cloud, we won't actually even own any kind of physical object, not even a file. Instead, we'll just be owning that music in the cloud, and we'll be listening to music, the same kind of music, but it's going to be a service that we'd probably be paying for. And it actually has really interesting implications for talking about the internet as well, and that it actually all mass media, and that we're shifting away from kind of the legacy companies in each mass media into, and we see it first in music again, which actually started all this with Napster. We're seeing where Amazon and Google and Apple become kind of the dominant distribution companies. So that really kind of changes things, and I point that out because we can see the same thing happening in the future in TV and film and in every other kind of business as well. I also asked them to think about television and cable as an example. And they're the things that they're familiar with are Hulu, some with Xfinity, which is Comcast's version of Hulu, some networks like CBS and ABC that stream video, and certainly Netflix. And it's always interesting to see how many students access Netflix through different devices. And that looks like the way that TV is going to be experienced in the future. In fact, Verizon and Redbox also have a competing service that they've announced in 2012. Blockbuster's trying to do the same thing with the Dish Network. And since no one seems to go to video stores anymore, and so we're seeing and experiencing TV on all kinds of different screens through all types of different ways. And what I'd like to have students think about is how that impacts the cable business. And to preface that a little bit, what I talk about is that the cable industry for years and years really resisted offering a la carte cable to customers, where you could actually select the channels you wanted to watch and not have to pay for the other ones. And most studies seem to point out that people watch maybe 10 to 12 channels most often and really don't pay much attention to the other ones. So, the argument would go for a la carte is, why can't we just buy those, like a magazine service, buy the magazines we want and not buy the rest? The cable industry, of course, hasn't wanted that for financial reasons. But what's happening is that, kind of like in the way with music, the consumers themselves are kind of selecting and forming the new way of the business, and the industry, the cable industry, is going to be playing catch-up. So what we're going to see is people actually buying the channels a la carte via the internet, and cable at least has a little bit in on their business there because they're in many ways, many times supplying the internet connection as well. But the cable business does not look like a very good business. So we're at the very beginning of what looks like the cable business might go the way of the VHS Blockbuster store, or so that's something for them to think about. And I go one step further. If that's going to happen, then we won't have as much revenue flowing into channels like ESPN, and that could affect then. And my sports-minded students will perk up when they hear this. That could affect, certainly the contracts that major universities and pro football and baseball and basketball organizations are getting from cable, like ESPN, since that's really bid up all the kinds of contracts that organizations have gotten. So that could potentially change the way we experience sports. One last example I like to talk about with students, or that I'll at least give you, is the book industry. And this kind of goes back to history and back to what Richard was talking about. And for thinking about Convergence, it really all happens with Amazon, which began in 1995, which is now responsible for about 20% of all book sales in the United States. So that was one part of the business. With the introduction of Kindle in 2007, Amazon really followed the lead of what Apple did with the iTunes Store and selling music, and did the same thing really with their device, which is kind of iPod-like, and selling ebooks that way. And interestingly enough, Apple sold songs for 99 cents when they first started, and Kindle did the same thing, a little bit more expensive, $9.99. And so that really changed the business. Other companies, of course, Apple has gotten in on that business, and Google has tried to as well. And again, those are those recurring major internet companies that are really having a big effect on how we distribute things. And then we get the Kindle Fire as a response to the iPad as a touchscreen. So that's an interesting thing for students to think about how Amazon has worked. And one of the interesting things as well is that Amazon has actually become a publisher of books too. And that's certainly something that the industry is paying attention to, especially publishers. And it's kind of a recurring thing. It goes back to a situation that had happened in the movie industry with the studios, where they were vertically integrated and they did everything, the production, distribution, and exhibition. And Amazon, as a publisher of books, with the Kindle Fire and with their store, puts themselves in that same kind of situation. So it's something to kind of keep an eye on, and a nice thing to kind of tie back into how we talk about the movie industry. If you remember what happened to the movie industry, of course, they had to get rid of one of those three parts of the vertical integration. Eventually they sold their theaters, which is why in towns all across the United States we see either torn down, in the 70s earlier, but renovated, Paramount theaters or MGM theaters and that sort of thing, or Fox theaters. The final thing I want to leave you with was to think about how to connect back to history. And I have one discussion started that I've just been experimenting with this semester. But I want students to think about the meanings of content and the meanings that we attach to the medium that delivers the content. Which gets back to that question. I'm not sure what we're talking about when we talk about a medium anymore. Are we thinking about the delivery system, or are we thinking about the content? So I put up an image for students, and it's this image of an old book. It looks like it might be a Bible or some kind of holy book, and then a Kindle Fire. And I asked them, what does it mean to burn or defile a book? And especially, people have followed in the news burnings of the Quran or burnings of the Bible, and that's certainly upsetting to people. And I'm wondering, I asked them, what happens if you do that same action if it's done to a tablet device or a digital file? So if you burn a Kindle Fire that maybe had the Quran or had the Bible on it, does that have the same meaning as burning the actual book? You think about the holy book and the way it's treated and revered by people. If we put that content on a digital device, does it mean the same thing? So it really gets at this question that I certainly don't have a complete answer to about the meaning. Is the device, is the old form medium more important, or is the content more important? And that's a nice thing to throw out to your students, certainly for a discussion starter. It could be a great topic for a long paper as well, thinking about what's the meaning of these sorts of things as we consider convergence. So I'll stop there and throw it back to Stacy.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris and Richard. We're now going to open it up to questions. If you have a question, of course, you can type it in the chat box. and we're monitoring those questions. You can also use your electronic hand that's at the bottom of the participants panel to kind of raise your hand, and we'll unmute you, and you can ask your questions to Chris and Richard. And there are a lot of you, so we'll get to as many questions as we can. And Ada Fung, our editor, will be assisting us with the questions. Ada, do you have any questions from our speakers at this point?
Hi, yeah. One of our attendees, Dan Close, asked that we talk a little bit about the online teaching of this course. So, Richard, Chris, I don't know if either of you have any experience teaching this course online. You could give some insight into how you do it, or if you have any colleagues who have done it. I'm sure everyone will be interested in hearing about that.
Chris, you want to go?
Yeah, I have not taught this class online yet. I know we've done, being a department head as well, we've tried out a number of different courses online. I haven't done that one yet. I do use, certain online components. I've done a lot with Blackboard, for example. So some of you might be familiar with that. I think they bought up WebCT as well. So I put a lot of information on there, and I'll be using this fall CourseMart as I teach the course. I'm always kind of trying things out. But I actually haven't done it completely online yet, so I actually couldn't answer that. But if you have some specific questions about, what we think about what certain things might be like online, I could try to answer that, though.
I could also add, I have not done this either. I have more experience teaching writing courses online, like journalism writing courses, but not this course. I mean, I'm at our residential campus, and we don't do enough online teaching right now, but we're thinking about expanding. So I would think that some of our editors from Bedford, St. Martin's, might have more experience and not be more knowledgeable about this.
Yeah, we certainly have, we know people who use our books who do teach online, and we have online course spaces that have activities and stuff like that, and videos, and a lot of, relying a lot on, sort of blog assignments and discussion forums and things like that. I think that people have found success with video, in uploading, asking students to upload, interesting commercials or things like that. I've heard things like that when you're teaching advertising. So those are sort of the things that I've heard about. Yes, YouTube is definitely a great resource.
Ada,
yeah.
I could add one thing as well. I mean, I think Dan had mentioned something about the test and blog assignments. And I found, actually not with this class, but with some journalism classes that I've taught, when I do have questions online and ask people, to blog about something or respond to something, if I have just one question and say there's 25 or 30 students in the class, by the time it gets through the first 5 or 10, they've pretty much covered that question. So the other people, tend to be answering in more the Me Too variety. So what I would suggest, and what I found is that it's better to ask multiple questions and maybe even kind of break people down to answer separate questions rather than give one question for everyone, because then they just kind of run out of things to say by the time it gets to the other people. So that's kind of a difficulty of doing things online. It actually, and I think it's probably unappreciated, but it takes a lot of work for everyone to be able to see, to be able to prepare for that, and then for the class to be able to kind of have a useful conversation online.
Okay, we got another question. How much of an impact has the media literacy field had on your work? Richard, Chris, either of you?
Well, for me, when we first started working on media and culture, I mean, part of it was, for me, a way to make sure we taught critical thinking skills to our students. And I think of critical thinking and media literacy as somewhat interchangeable. The notion that partly what we have to do is make our students media literate. I mean, the interesting thing to me about the teaching of history is our students are technologically savvy, much more savvier than I am on so many levels. But they really lack a grounding in history and the importance of history, which is why I think it's so important. And, there's so many interesting stories in history, from Philo Farnsworth, his legal battles with RCA, as, barely out of his teen years, to, Sarnoff, being a runner for Marconi in New York City when he was 15 years old, running flowers to Marconi's girlfriends who were all over New York. Students love those stories, and there's so many of them in history, and it's a way that you can sort of make this come alive, which I think is always the challenge. But in fact, I think teaching media history in many ways is easier than teaching traditional history because of the stories are interesting, and they have connections to these media because the media have not gone away. They've just transformed.
I would add, actually our other co-author, Bettina Fabos, is also at University of Northern Iowa with me. She actually teaches this course, an introduction to mass communication, but also teaches a media literacy course. And what we find is that, this course is so good at actually kind of laying out the history, and you really need that context, I think, before you study any more media literacy after that. But that history, and then also knowing how to do the critical process. So we do a lot of media literacy in this course as we teach about the history. Really sets them up nicely for an intermediate or advanced course in media literacy, where you're going to be doing even more detailed criticisms of the media. So I think the history is really important. If you don't know about the history, you certainly don't know where the media are going or could be going. But it's hard to be critical. I mean, I can't imagine writing about television or film without understanding where it came from and understanding what kinds of films or shows or other things had happened previously.
Thank you. Sort of as a continuation of that question, we have another question. What is the mix between history and theory in a 100-level class? I struggle with getting the facts in as well as the fun and challenging dialogue. Richard, Chris, do you want to speak a little bit as to how you sort of achieve that balance, make sure you get everything, the facts that students need to know, clearly, and also have these fun and interesting discussions?
Well, I think one of the challenges I face, I'll just use an example here because I always think, how much do you do theory in a beginning class? I like to teach the concept of hegemony in the basic class, and sort of struggling with how to represent that was a challenge. And I think even early on in the textbook, we didn't sort of deal with this sort of head on. But increasingly over time, I like to use examples. When I sort of talk about hegemony works, I use the example from my days teaching at Middle Tennessee State, where we were living in a state that had no state income tax, still does, and yet most of the people who were against the state income tax would actually have benefited by a state income tax. They would pay less tax overall because the sales tax would go down. And one of the ways that I used to illustrate, why do people do things that aren't in their best economic interest? Why do people make those kinds of decisions? And if you looked at the way things operated in Tennessee when I was living there, every politician ran on the same platform: no state income tax. And every time a governor would come along who would want to put an income tax in place, because Tennessee didn't have oil, didn't have gambling, didn't have other resources to particularly support higher education and other educational ventures. But some of the biggest ringleaders in no state income tax were radio talk show hosts who would come out in mass and organize in the state. And pretty much their story was, you give the government an inch and they'll take a mile. What they really did in their storytelling was demonize government to a large extent, so that government was evil. And even though it was in an individual's interest not not to pay us to have a state income tax because they weren't making enough. This narrative about the government as demon was a much more powerful narrative in their life, and continued, I think, to explain why people, act against their own self-interest. So I found that particular example really compelling to students, because a lot of times the students who were most opposed to the state income tax were students whose actual tuition would go down if there had been a state income tax in Tennessee. So that's sort of one example. But I think at the intro level, you can introduce concepts like that, but I think the key thing is to find examples that sort of lead you into how you explain theory at a level that both challenges them and doesn't oversimplify.
I would just agree with that. That's actually a great way of talking about that. I was just talking about hegemony this week as well, and actually was talking about sometimes it's easier for students to see something when it's historically, but talking about smoking and tobacco, and how tobacco, it's sold, it's been sold in various times by Virginia Slims in the 70s, and even by Edward Bernays, one of these early PR people in the late 20s, as freedom for women. So they're torches of liberty, they're torches of freedom, and which is versus thinking about them in another way is that actually this is just a product that they want you to buy, and one that's clearly not healthy for you. So, so how do you convince people to actually go against their own best interest? So I talk about that from a public relations and advertising perspective. But that would certainly be another example of hegemony. But I'm going to
Bernays is great, Chris, because his definition of PR is another definition of hegemony, the engineering of consent. It's a really good way into sort of discussing how hegemony is operationalized.
So I think these ideas help to make theory fun. So part of it is coming up with good examples and telling stories. I think that's a way to kind of engage people. So you have to connect with a way that they can understand it. But I think I don't think just because it's a 100-level course that you have to dispose of all theory. I think there's ways of making sure that those really fundamental concepts get in there too.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Chris. All right, next question is, so I found that my class has changed, my students and my class has changed a lot, even within the last 3 to 5 years. What have the two of you either taught more of or taught less of, or has the focus of your course changed at all over in the last 3 to 5 years?
I've had that same experience, and one of the things that I find I'm doing more is talking less and listening to students, especially when I'm trying to understand social media. My daughter still won't let me get a Facebook account, so I really depend on my students to explain to me this phenomenon. And one of the most interesting things that I've noticed in my class is how many of the students, this has happened in my last 2 honors classes in the media survey course, are complaining about how much time they have to devote to Facebook. This is very different from, college students generally have never they've never devoted a lot of time watching television like the general population. But, we have, the average Facebook user, I think it's up to like 6 hours a day. And I have really smart students talking about being addicted to Facebook and worrying about it. And this was not true, I would say. This is increasingly a concern that this generation has.
Yeah, I do the same thing. Actually, what I've tried to do in just the past 3 to 5 years is open up. I teach this course twice a week, actually. So every Tuesday and Thursday, I try to open up with whatever I glean from the news that is connected with something we're talking about that week or something we've already talked about or will be talking about later in the term. So, for example, in just the past week or so, I've talked about, when the Hunger Games opened, about how that was one of the biggest movie openings, of all time. But more so, I connected it back to the fact that Hunger Games was actually produced by an independent studio, which connected back to what we had talked about a few weeks earlier when we were talking about the film industry. More recently, I've talked about we've been kind of following along every little kind of drop of the shoe with Murdoch's News Corporation and the scandal of intercepting phone conversations in England. And so there was the more recent thing that emerged was that Murdoch's son resigned from the board of B-Sky B, their big cable company and satellite company over there, because it turns out they're doing it on the TV side as well. So just there's so much happening. It seems like every week there is something. So and when I ask these things, I talk to students about it. I see some heads nodding, so some students are paying attention. And for those who aren't, next time they hear about that story, it will connect in with them. So, almost every week, and the only way to keep up with that is just read the newspaper, read the New York Times, or get some other information pushed to you. Some people like to use Slate.com's Today's Papers, which just gives them in their mailbox the top stories of every day. So that's kind of a nice way to keep up with it, or read anything in the trades, Wired magazine, or other things like that will help keep up with those sorts of things.
Okay. All right. Wow, we're getting quite a few questions. All right, we'll try and get to as many as we can. From Ellen Slavitz, when teaching this course, I found myself spending a lot of my prep time staying informed on current media developments. How much time do you spend with current events versus history and theory?
Well, I think that's really a challenge. I mean, I tried to address that in my opening remarks. It can feel really overwhelming just to keep up with issues. I'm really dependent on the Monday, New York Times media section in the business just to sort of keep up. But I also find it's an incredible challenge. And I think that's, one of the things that I've experienced in sort of letting go and realizing that my students can actually help me learn about social media and introduce me to stuff, and I can actually sort of use them as peer teachers to sort of lead discussions on this. We have really good discussions. I have an exercise I do in which I have them put up sort of the pros and cons of Facebook, and it really almost always leads to a rich discussion and gets them to think about these things. And I learn a lot, as somebody who's not on Facebook. And I saw one question. My daughter now is 28, and this has been going on for about 3 years, where she says, "Don't get a Facebook account." But the truth is, it's so much trouble keeping up anyway. I don't want a Facebook account. I've got my hands full, just reading the paper right now. So becoming more dependent on your students, I think, to sort of work through these issues is a new thing for us. I think most of us who've been at this a long time walked into the classroom, thought of ourselves an expert on all this, and then boom, the digital age came, and we have to do things a little bit differently, and we have to make those adjustments.
It is kind of crazy. I actually do have a Facebook account, but I have days where I regret never having one, just because it can be so time-consuming just to keep up with it. I try to experiment with certain things. I do the same thing Richard does. I really have to talk to my students and find out what they're doing and what they find interesting. In fact, it was just earlier this term when we were talking about the music industry that I realized that just a few students, and actually a very big class, were starting to get their music from Spotify, because Spotify had just come and been released in the United States. And I had known that, and I was familiar with that, but I didn't realize that they were also using and sharing Spotify online. So they're actually doing like a Spotify chat where they're listening to the same music at the same time with their friends. And there were a few students that, immediately when that came out, they knew about that and were doing it. So that was something interesting that I learned. So so I just kind of opened up. I said, well, tell me about that. Tell all of us about that. How do you do it? What do you have to do to do this? And I think a lot of students ended up signing up for it afterwards. But it was a nice way to kind of share information. So you're absolutely right what Richard says. I mean, the students become great resources in this. So it's nice for us to bring things into the class, but there's just so much. I mean, teaching the class 20 years ago was just so different. So there's so much now that it's nice to have them share, and it's actually a nice way for teaching as well. It makes them feel very engaged to be part of that. So when students are emailing you ideas after the class or have things that they raise their hand and offer in class, that you're really engaging them. So that's a nice thing to do.
Sort of along that line, Joy McDonald asked, what are your students saying about Twitter? My students are into Twitter more than Facebook. Any experiences with Twitter? Do you use it in class?
Take it, Chris.
So I'm relatively active with Facebook. I do have a Twitter account. I don't tweet very often, so and I suppose it's just the number of hours in a day. But I do know a lot of students using it. Strangely enough, we have someone in our communication studies department who directs our internships and actually tweets out a list of new internships all the time to students. But I know students are communicating quite a bit that way. So I have to force myself into it to kind of see what people are doing. I'm finding it's kind of interesting especially when we think about professionally and as we teach about journalism, that it's become a really big thing in journalism. So people use it on a personal basis, but I do talk about how it's become a big thing for journalists to tweet their stuff, but also, and especially interesting in this year, 2012, as we go through campaigns, about how campaigns, presidential, congressional, and gubernatorial, are using Twitter as a way to release statements, which is interesting because they're really short statements because it's Twitter, but I think that's kind of what they like. They don't have to actually offer any kind of context. They can just put something out there and kind of not be responsible for fleshing it out. So I think it serves them well. So we've had kind of interesting discussions about how Twitter is used by certain groups and organizations effectively.
Great. I just actually wanted to add to that. I met a professor recently at a conference who uses Twitter with his class. He creates a hashtag, and so the assignment will be everyone has to watch the State of the Union, and you're going to tweet your thoughts about it using the class's hashtag during the State of the Union. So something like that people have found, especially for online classes, to be a way to sort of engage and have a conversation without being in person.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to take two more questions because I know everyone is busy and has stuff to do. So this one from Lloyd Matzner. In the intro course, having enough time to cover the last chapters of the text always seems to be a challenge due to lack of time. Any suggestions for incorporating the themes earlier in the semester?
Well, I face that same challenge too with my own textbook, getting to, and I tend to focus more on what my interests are. I don't worry about that too much. I mean, I do ask the students to read all the chapters, but sometimes, I maybe don't get to the research chapter, for example, because I like to devote more time to television and to news. Those are the things that I'm interested in, and I feel like we all have our areas of expertise and then the things that we care about more than others, and I think it's perfectly fine, to put more of the responsibility on students to sort of keep up and do the reading. One of the things that I've been doing with my honors class lately is sort of taking the chapters and giving the students responsibility for introducing the sort of main themes of the chapter and some contemporary issue going on with either radio or magazines at the beginning of every class to give them a little bit more ownership and give them some role in sort of prepping the class for the rest of us. And that seems to go pretty well. I think it works again in a smaller class, be harder to do in the big lecture class.
Yeah, and I think I like Richard's idea. You can kind of select the things you really like to focus on. In my department, in recent years, we've added an Intro to Research Methods class that's required of everyone. So it makes, for example, that research methods chapter maybe less crucial. I mean, should I get too busy with other things. And sometimes I'm flexible with the class. If there's a major event that comes out, we may spend a lot more time talking about that in relation to what we're covering in the course. So we might focus a little bit more on things. So I'm a little bit flexible about that. I do find as I get towards the end of the semester, and we're all getting there, that I oftentimes will just there's certain things that I won't cover, but I'll just remind them. If I'm going to be having test questions about it, make sure you read this part in the book. We won't have as much time to discuss it, but be responsible for that.
Yeah, and I would add too. I mean, one of the challenges we face is adding new stuff. I mean, we're struggling right now whether to add a separate chapter on video games and to break that out from what we've been doing. And for me, I don't have any expertise in this. I mean, I have to study it to write about it, but it's not something I do or that I've learned from. But our students, come to us with sort of a wealth of experience growing up playing video games today, and I think we have to treat that seriously. But, again, how do you find time for all of this? How do you deal with that stuff? Video games is another area where I'm really dependent on my students to sort of lead those conversations and talk about what the key issues are.
Great, thank you. Last question, how does the model of WikiLeaks, in your opinion, impact news media and sourcing? Fun one to end on.
Richard?
Well, I've dealt with WikiLeaks a couple of times. I used the great piece by Bill Keller that in the New York Times when he first started writing about this, and later would write a book on this. I mean, I just think that whole area of freedom of information, who's a journalist, who's not a journalist, those are sort of fascinating questions. And one of the things that I like to tell students is, being a journalist is one of the very few things you don't need a license to do, as a professional. I mean, there's no licensing because of the First Amendment. And so this sort of claim to who's a journalist, what kind of information can be circulated, is really crucial. And then the news media's role in responsibility and what to circulate and what not to circulate. Bill Keller's piece, particularly the Time magazine or the New York Times Magazine piece on this, is really a rich resource of getting a handle on this, and he sort of takes you step by step, through his whole experience working with WikiLeaks on releasing that early cache of documents.
Yeah, I tend to cover that, the issue of WikiLeaks when I talk about both the news media and news media culture, but also when we talk about mass communication law. So it's actually really helpful there. As I'm thinking about that, there have been some interesting discussions happening recently about, I don't know if you're familiar with the book now, the movie series, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, but there's a character who actually gets this great information and gives it to her journalist friend, and she's a hacker and finds some really wonderful stuff that way. So it's kind of a similar type of thing there, and it actually raises those issues. And there's been, and that's a fictional story, but it's actually raised similar types of questions. If you look like at the pointer.org website and the kinds of discussions that are happening there between journalists and journalist teachers. So it's a fascinating topic and an interesting question you provided.
Great, thanks. So the last question I got was just actually a question for Bedford, asking whether or not we would be providing a space or a blog, some sort of discussion forum for Mass Comm instructors to interact and share assignment ideas or interesting articles, things that work with their students. We are definitely planning that. We have heard interest from a lot of people for a space like that, and I think it would be a great thing to have, a great resource for instructors. So we will keep you updated when we have something like that. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Back to you, Stacy.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. I was just going to say the same thing. Thanks to everyone for participating today. We will be archiving this this webinar at the link below, and we'll send you an email with this link as well. Feel free to share that with colleagues. And thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.